This is part two, and I'll do just a short little part because I'm doing the equivalent of having you do group work by doing that extra uh, study and comparison of translations. So just want to maybe just for a few minutes here um, sort of summarize where we've been and talk a little bit more about Tyndale's translation. So Tyndale's translation was in 1525, right at the beginning of the Reformation. And it was in 1534 that England broke away. So simply within 15 years of uh, the the first part of the Reformation. Again, this wasn't all religious. Spain broke away and still remained very Catholic. So there was some political pieces to all this as well. But amazingly, within a couple of years after, and Tyndale was strangled and burned at the stake in 1536, within a couple of years, sure enough, um, uh, King Henry VIII authorizes a translation for the church. And guess what they use as a basis for most of the translating work? And guess what? It was the work that Tyndale had already done. And there, throughout the 16th century, and you can read this in Brother Bernard's chapters, there was a layer after layer after layer of different attempts to make a English Bible. They didn't like the Geneva Bible because it had Calvin's notes in it, and they weren't Calvinists. So ultimately, you get a request in 1604. Could we have an official version? And that official version, of course, is what King James authorized and was completed in 1611. And that is the King James version. Now, people say, well, I want the King James, you know, because that's what's right and that's what God wants and that's how Jesus taught and all that. And once you get a translation that's around for so long, it becomes so ingrained, particularly if you're a Bible quizzer. I mean, King James, I mean, yeah, I lived and died by King James and still am familiar with it. I have to work against the translation, what I've memorized in my head. I'm trying to rememorize some things to get rid of the these and thous in the New King James. Um, so that when I teach a Bible study, or when I talk to people, I'm not creating a bridge that they can't get across very readily. I teach a graduate school class called Biblical Interpretation, and for the last 10 years, usually, not always, but usually one of the main, this is the first class I take, one of the main group work settings that I have them do when they first walk in, again, this is a class in Bible interpretation, is I don't have them sit down with a Bible, but I have them sit down with a section of Hamlet, and I say, okay, what does this mean? Interpret it for me. You can go online, you can Google it, you can do whatever you want. And sometimes, almost always, I'll have an English teacher in there and people that or studied Hamlet, and so the obscure words they're able to bring to light as the group work finishes. And then I ask them, how would you make that interesting to a youth group? And then I ask them, what applications can you make? So I'm using the same principles they use with the biblical text, and this also helps because sometimes people come in there and there's maybe they're an official in the youth department or home missions or whatever, not home missions, but church, North American missions. Or maybe they're not, and so sometimes it can be intimidating and this sort of lowers the bar for everybody. But then there's another reason I do it is when they're all done, I'll say, okay, now this is Elizabethan English. This is Elizabethan English, and what you need to know is what was language that was so strange to you is the same English that the King James is translated into. And while I love the King James, it's a beautiful version, when somebody comes into the church and they listen to that, sometimes that's a hurdle. That's high. That we automatically translate the these and thous in our heads, but for them, some of the archaic language is difficult for them. I'm for the King James, and you can read Brother Bernard's chapter here, and he's not against King James, but he is for balance, and he is working toward what was the history of it and so on. Now, we talked about this a little bit last time. Second edition of Erasmus is what uh, King King James was derived from, and the way it was derived from it is through a number of other translations that essentially the King James was in some ways a revision of. And the shorthand of that is that King James is on some level a fifth revision of Tyndale's original translation. So Tyndale is a significant player in terms of Bible translation, and many of the phrases and even words that we use in the English language today hail back to that original Tyndale translation into English. He was a man who paid the ultimate price for his faith, but he was a key player in all that went on. Now, the reflection questions are posted, and they'll be largely on the reading and also on the group work that you're doing individually with comparing translations on Proverbs chapter 3.